Due Process, for the second consecutive year, recipient of Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
We got working gloves, a half working jacket, a mask, and a half-a-liter skim milk. The 6 of us who worked over there during the 12-hour shift.
Can money ever compensate former slaves? Should companies pay for slave labor used in World War II? Up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Human slavery, a term some might regard as purely historical, yet a New Jersey court will soon have to resolve a case concerning claims for compensation to former slaves. I'm Raymond Brown, and a suit filed by survivors of Nazi slave labor is before a federal district court here in New Jersey. The case is controversial, and it raises larger questions about whether and when slaves should be paid back for forced labor. Here's an in-depth due process report.
We arrived to Auschwitz on June 2nd, 1944. Everyone was screaming. Dogs were barking, and the soldiers screamed, "Faster, dirty Jew," in German, certainly. And men in striped uniforms was whispering, "Say that you are 18.
Ellie Gross was just 15 when she was sent to the concentration camp. She never saw her mother or brother again, but she was lucky in a sense. She was deemed fit for work.
We were housed in the factory building itself, which was street level. We had one bed, everybody, a blanket, and we had warm water.
The factory was Volkswagen's main plant in Fallersleben, Germany. Along with thousands of others, she became an expendable cog in the Nazi wartime machine.
In front of us was a table, and we got like a pistol, and we pushed the paint, and that with the other hand we had to move that round object.
Mrs. Gross applied paint to munition parts from sunup to sundown, a virtual slave in a labor-starved Germany. Those who became too ill or exhausted to work were returned to Auschwitz for extermination. Somehow she stayed alive the 8 months until liberation.
I think all the time my destiny was to survive, and always I say that my parents prayed in the heaven.
Ellie Gross lost her teeth and her health, but she had her life. She never expected payment for her work, but Melvin Weiss sees things differently.
Right now we're focusing on big companies that still survive today and that are doing business in the United States so that we can get jurisdiction over them. Thus far, we have filed actions against Volkswagen, Daimler-Benz, IG Farben, Krupps, Siemens.
Mel Weiss has some experience in regaining lost assets. He began the class action suit against the Swiss banks that now has spread to include U.S. banks. In the Swiss case, they settled for $1.25 billion.
It's clear that the survivors of these kinds of atrocities are all over the world, and we're going to have to reach out with multiple notices to try to get people who have an entitlement to file claims.
The slave labor case against Volkswagen was filed in August in the District of New Jersey. The company is described as having its principal places of business in New Jersey, although its corporate office is in Michigan. While Volkswagen would not comment, it has issued a statement. Volkswagen recognizes the sad truth that many people were forced to work for almost every German company during the war. This also occurred at the government-owned factory which was liberated by the Allies in 1945 and later was acquired by today's Volkswagen. The Volkswagen of today was created after the war when the British Allied forces rebuilt it anew. Volkswagen, as it has evolved after the war, holds the deepest possible regret for the inhumanities that occurred during that terrible time. Regret is not enough for Mel Weiss, though.
Here are people who got paid nothing, right? So the first thing we would try to determine is what did somebody who wasn't a forced or slave laborer get paid under that system at that time. And we would add the time value of money over the 50 some odd years that they didn't get paid to that amount. In addition, we would try to get disgorgement of whatever profits these companies made out of these slave laborers and try to get that money into a pot.
The class action seeks punitive damages as well. And while it's been over 50 years since the war, the statute of limitations clock, according to Weiss, has just begun ticking.
There was a treaty entered into, we refer to as the London Treaty, that immunized German companies from this kind of responsibility for a period of time. It wasn't until 1997 when a German court ruled that the treaty no longer was a barrier. So that's one of the arguments we use for tolling the statute of limitations and permitting these actions to start now.
No justice could bring me back what I lost, my family, my parents, and my life. Never justice could bring it back. Who knows, whenever they pay something, how much monetary value that will have. Maybe I won't live so long, but at least we talk about and we remind the world.
The West German government has so far paid over $70 billion in compensation, but German private industry has to date paid little. Most maintain they were not in control of their companies or that the civil courts are not the proper forum. Mel Weiss is pressing on with some help.
It takes a lot of lawyers to fight the battle. We now have probably access to 30 law firms.
And while the complaint calls for jury trial, his expectation is a negotiated settlement.
If it isn't, it will be a horrible thing, but I think it'll be far more horrible for the companies that we're suing than it will be for anybody else. Will it gain justice? Of course not. Justice can never be measured in terms of dollars, but it will solve some degree of emotional and psychological need for the people who suffered most and went through this anguish.
Justice, a sometimes elusive concept. Everyone acknowledges that no amount of money can fairly compensate people for being enslaved. On the other hand, isn't some recompense better than nothing? This question has come up in the Volkswagen case. It is still being raised by those who seek reparations for American slavery and continues to inspire argument in places like the Sudan and North Africa. We will be discussing this important issue with well-informed guests in just a moment as Due Process continues.
I think that the damage that was done to these people in wartime should be recompensed in some way.
It's hard to compensate people today on what happened 50, 60, 70, or 100 years ago. That's difficult to do. I don't know if you can go into the court system and actually compensate people for that. So I would let it lie.
Bygones be bygones is not the way to handle it. I think at least the case should be heard, and how it's determined is based on the facts that they bring forward.
A New Jersey suit against Volkswagen for slave labor in World War II. Why here? Why now? Is money an appropriate remedy? Are these new questions? To discuss these issues, we are joined by two knowledgeable guests. In Trenton, Alan Light, well known to every trial lawyer in New Jersey as the clerk of the district court until 1986. Alan represents Ellie Gross and other plaintiffs in the suit against Volkswagen. And in Newark, Bernard Freeman, a professor of law at Seton Hall, an expert in Islamic law, and the recent author of an important article on slavery written in the Harvard Rights Journal. I should add that due process invited representatives of Volkswagen who declined to appear. Alan, let me start with you. We did ask Volkswagen to come. They declined to appear. But one of the arguments they make, and I think our viewers saw it in the report that we showed, is a letter in which they basically say this is the new Volkswagen. The Volkswagen that exists in New Jersey now is not the same Volkswagen that enslaved people in 1940 to 1945. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think the real issue is how did the new Volkswagen come to be? The new Volkswagen was incorporated in New Jersey in 1955, certainly after the war. But where did the money come from to incorporate Volkswagen of America? And how was that company funded, and how was it capitalized, and what monies were used to create what we now know as Volkswagen of America? We believe, and we think we can prove, that this money all came from Volkswagen Germany, Volkswagen AG in Germany. And we know, and I think that history will prove us out through much of the information that we've already gathered, that Volkswagen AG became a very, very wealthy company because of slave labor that it used during the war. Volkswagen AG didn't have to pay its workers. It used up its workers.
So your argument is that essentially Volkswagen that exists now is the same. It's a continuous existence and not a new entity, as Volkswagen itself says.
Well, I think that they've created a new legal entity by creating Volkswagen of America. But if the monies that were used to create that company came from slave labor, we believe that these individuals that we represent, the plaintiffs in this case, that money should be held for them in some sort of a constructive trust to be paid back over to them when we have been able to prove the liability in this case.
Let me deal with one of the other criticisms that's come of this suit, not from Volkswagen, but from others who may be allied with these plaintiffs on other issues. Mr. Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League has said, look, when you're talking about slave labor as opposed to money stolen by banks or insurance companies, there's no way to compensate people, and it cheapens the process. It cheapens the whole experience to try to compare dollars to that experience and to seek compensation in dollars. How do the people you represent respond to that argument?
Well, I understand Mr. Foxman's argument, and we don't disagree on many things. The goal is certainly the same. Mr. Foxman has also talked about trying to seek the truth, and what we're trying to do is get the truth. As part of getting that truth, we can get information from these companies as exactly what they did, which individuals worked for them.
But you're also seeking money damage.
Absolutely. Because in the end, the truth will always be the truth, but we have individuals that need to be compensated, that in many cases in Europe are starving, they don't have money, and there's simply no reason why a company that has made a fortune off of the blood and the backs of these individuals should not be forced to disgorge some of that money to take care of these people in their old age.
Bernard Freeman, in fact, the controversy involves, among other things, the question of whether there should be dollars paid for slave labor that took place in the 1940s. Is this a new issue? You've been looking at the question of slavery as part of the human experience. Is it unique to have this argument joined now?
Oh, not at all. First of all, I think one of the things I discovered that in my research was that actually most of the Judaic law came about, the Jewish law and the Hebrew law came about as a result of the freedom of the Jews from slavery in Egypt. And the book of Genesis, as well as Exodus and Leviticus, were all announced against that background.
What,
and then,
has the question of compensation come up in the context?
The question of compensation did not come up then, except that there was responsibility. People talked about responsibility. The question of compensation has come up, though, rather regularly every time there's been an emancipation of slaves, going back to the emancipation of the American black slaves right after the Civil War. And then with the emancipation of the Islamic, slaves of Islamic rulers on the east coast of Africa in the early 20th century, people have constantly asked for compensation.
I recall you and I discussing this subject one other time, and you had said that sometimes the issue was who should be compensated, that there were some systems that talked about compensating owners who lost their slaves?
Yeah, most of the time that's actually who was compensated, because the thing was, except in the American situation, I'm not so sure that happened, but certainly in Africa, when slavery was abolished in Africa, at that time there was no real widespread opinion that slavery was unlawful, and so it was the owners of the slaves who demanded compensation, and sometimes they got it either from the British or the French colonial the colonial governments that came in and accomplished the abolition of slavery. They would demand compensation, and oftentimes they would get it. It was usually a pittance, but they would get some compensation. And I think in Zanzibar and on the east coast of Africa, there was also some compensation given, or at least provisions in terms of land or housing or some other kind of material compensation given to the former slaves. It was never very much, and it was always mostly a symbolic thing rather than, as I think your piece pointed out, it's very difficult for someone to put a money amount on that kind of experience.
Alan, I'm sure that your clients and yourself would concede that there isn't any accurate way to measure it. That is, for example, the damages you've described, paying people in some way at the rate at which they would have been paid there, even plus interest, doesn't take into account other aspects of slave suffering that are a part of the concept of slavery.
Well, there's no question of that. But I do believe that we can, because Volkswagen kept very precise records. We can determine which individuals worked. We can determine for those who worked that were paid what their rate of pay was, as Mr. Weiss talked about in the opening piece. There is a way to compute all of that. That would give us certainly a basis. Anything that should then be added onto that would be for the remainder of the experience, for which certainly no amount of money can ever compensate these individuals.
In addition to the question of whether or not dollars or currency could compensate people for the experience of slavery, there is kind of, I guess, the obvious question people would ask: why here, why now? That is, why is this suit being brought in 1998 in New Jersey for actions that took place in the 40s in Germany as part of the war effort and as part of the effort to exterminate the Jews?
Well, the answer to that question really has to do with two things. Number one, Volkswagen of America is a New Jersey company. It's incorporated here.
But it could be sued, in theory, in many states.
It could be sued literally in any place in which it does business. But it was incorporated here, and since the time it was incorporated in 1955, Volkswagen of America has had a very strong presence in New Jersey. Secondly, the answer to why now is because now we can finally, for the first time. After the war, the treaties that were entered into among the United States and Germany and the remaining allies created what was called the London Debt Agreement. And in 1953, that agreement was signed. And basically what the agreement did was to defer any actions by individuals against private corporations for slave labor until such time as the agreement recognized would be the end of what was called the reparations phase of the Second World War. Well, finally, in November of 1997, for the first time, a German court said that the reparations phase of the war is now concluded, and therefore, now for the first time, the field is now open to go ahead and to try to bring these claims. So in early 1998, we brought the first claim, which was against another manufacturer, which was against Ford, and the Volkswagen case and others have since followed.
Would it be fair to say, however, that you expect that the lawyers representing Volkswagen will be filing motions or legal papers in which they would claim that this claim made by your plaintiffs is out of time?
Well,
you expect them to claim that? I'm not asking you to agree with your adversary.
Ford certainly filed papers. The Ford motions to dismiss are going to be heard in March. Volkswagen of America filed a motion to dismiss, but not on those grounds. It filed a motion to dismiss on grounds that we could not establish a constructive trust. Volkswagen AG, the German parent, has yet to respond, and we expect that when it does respond, that it will respond much in the same way.
By the term constructive trust, you're going back to the question of whether this Volkswagen here is really connected in some linear way to the Volkswagen that offended by using slave labor.
Correct. Whether or not the monies can be traced of coming from Volkswagen AG into the United States to form Volkswagen of America.
Go ahead, Bernard.
It does seem to me that if, unlike with the African Americans, where there are probably, I don't think there are any living slaves from the African American experience. In this particular case, the fact that Mr. Light does have two plaintiffs who are still alive and can testify about their experience would suggest, at least to me strongly, that it would not be just to apply the statute of limitations in that circumstance. Whereas with the African American experience, most people have argued that to waive the statute of limitations and to pay grandchildren or great-grandchildren of slaves really doesn't accomplish much. So there's a little difference there, I think.
But not to look at another side of that argument. Alan Light used the term reparations, and there is in the African American community at least a school of thought that says reparations should be paid to the descendants of slaves because earlier promises to pay initially by the Freedmen's Bureau and other government agencies were not lived up to. That's an argument that's been made, has it not?
Yeah, that's a pretty good argument, actually, in terms, it's like a contract argument that's a breach of promise, and that the breach of promise should be followed up on. But I don't think an American court, with all due respect to that argument, I don't think an American court would entertain it for very long. Perhaps in an international forum it might get more of a reception.
And there's also a political component to that argument, as there was, for example, a political component to the argument concerning the Japanese who were interned after World War II.
That's right. That's right. And I think there had to be an act of Congress, as I recall, in order to grant reparations to Japanese.
That's the ultimate political act. Alan, let me bring you to something that may be sort of a stereotypical way in which people view this. The case you brought is unique in that, for example, Ellie Gross, who was a Jew, was used as labor, but there was a policy of not just using those particular Jews like Ellie Gross for labor, but also working them to death. So it was a dual policy, both of labor and of destruction and extermination. But there were also non-Jews whose labor was employed in a similar manner, were there not?
As a matter of fact, our case is brought not on behalf of Jewish slave laborers. It's brought on behalf of all of those who performed slave labor for Volkswagen between 1940 and 1945, which included at one point, and the complaint alleges, and we have documentation to support it, that at one point 85% of all of Volkswagen's employees, and I use the word employees in quotes, were either slave laborers, individuals who were deported from captive nations and brought to work for Volkswagen, or prisoners of war. So the concentration camp victims, which were used to, for example, build the Fallersleben plant, the underground plant for Volkswagen, were joined by prisoners of war and by other deportees from captive nations. So the case is not just brought on behalf of Jewish slave laborers, it's brought on behalf of all of those who were asked to perform either forced labor, which we define as slightly different than slave labor, forced labor being those who were fed something and who were given some minor amount of money, as opposed to the slave laborers, which were the individuals that were taken from the concentration camps and literally worked until they were dead.
Bernard, at the outset of the program, I used the question of whether or not slavery was a historical process. But in fact, even now, there are human rights groups and some UN organs that claim that slavery continues, and there are some who are saying they are paying compensation to liberate slaves, especially in the Sudan and elsewhere. Is that an ongoing controversy in the legal and the international community?
Yes, absolutely. There is quite a bit of interest in two places, I would say, particularly in Sudan, and then also in India and Pakistan, involved with girls, young girls especially. In the Sudan, it's in the southern Sudan where there have been persistent allegations, and also Mauritania as well, a little to the west. There have been persistent allegations that that Arabized or people who speak Arabic, people from the north, have sometimes capture and use in a similar situation uncompensated labor, working people until death or until they waste away in various kinds of private enterprises in Sudan, and less so in Mauritania, but because of the war in Sudan, that's been the allegation. There are some Christian groups who have sent in people to liberate those persons and then use that liberation process to claim that there's still slavery going on. The controversy arises from the study that I've been doing with respect to that, mainly because it's a very feudal and very kind of agrarian society that had, in the southern Sudan, that had over many, many years developed a process of raiding where tribes would raid each other, and one of the things they would do when they raid each other is to capture young people able to work. And so
Bernard,
some of that's happening.
As we wind down, I wanted to ask you whether you're surprised at the end of the 20th century that slavery remains an ongoing controversy. Can you give me a short answer to that, because we're running out of time? Does it surprise you?
No, it's not surprising at all as far as I'm concerned. No, I think slavery may be with us for some time to come.
Alan Light, are you surprised that you're a lawyer involved in a case litigating about slavery in 1999?
I will tell you this, I never thought I would ever sign a complaint that used the name of Adolf Hitler in one of the counts of the complaint, but I did this time. Wow. And I think that it's the end of the century and it's time to at least remedy what we can.
Well, I want to thank you both for being with me to discuss what is an important subject, one that's not often touched on, but obviously still a part of human life. That's it for this edition of Due Process, but join us next week when our docket will include another important look at law and social justice.
The hope we have is that we will be able to get to the negotiating table as quickly as possible, and we're trying to run these cases on parallel tracks. We're not waiting for one to be over before we start another. That's why we filed many cases, and we're continuing to file cases. We're in negotiations with the Austrian banks. We have yet to start negotiations with the German banks or the German industrial companies, nor have we been approached for discussions by Ford Motor Company. We openly state that we would welcome such discussions.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.